Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Juan Sebastián Layne, but you can call me Seb as usual. I'm one of the moderators of our Ask Historians on Reddit, and today joining me is Dr. Darren S. Layne. He is the creator and curator of the Jacobite database of 1745. He got his PhD from the University of St. Andrews' Institute of Scottish Historical Studies, and he currently serves in the Council for Economic and Social History of Scotland. Today, he has joined me in order to talk about the Battle of Culloden, specifically about the upcoming anniversary, the 275th anniversary of this historical battle. Hello, Darren, and welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Seb. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, to those of us who have very little understanding and knowledge about the Jacobite movement in general, and specifically the Battle of Culloden, would you be so kind as to give us a brief general overview of what we historians call the 45 actually means?
Certainly. Yeah, the 45 was the final rising or rebellion of the Jacobites in 1745 and 1746 that started and ended in Scotland. Jacobites were followers of James Stuart, James the Second and Seventh specifically, who was deposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 89 by William and Mary. And the followers loyal to the Stuart cause were called Jacobites. Jacobus is Latin for James, hence the title. And James's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, would have been James III and VIII, third of England, eighth of Scotland. And his son, Charles Edward Stuart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, was the leader of the 45 rising in Scotland. The 45 took place from July until April, July 1745 to April 1746, and it was a broad national rising with international dimensions, people involved in Scotland, England, Ireland, France, and other countries in Europe. And it was part of the War of the Austrian Succession. So it has an international dimension that a lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with. They think it was a Scottish event or a British event only, but it was deeply tied in with European power politics in the middle of the 18th century. And the Jacobite movement itself lasted around 100 years, from 1688, from that revolution, all the way to the death of Charles Edward Stuart 100 years later, to the year, as a matter of fact. Culloden was the final battle of the Rising, and it happened on the 16th of April, 1746, just outside of Inverness in the Highlands of Scotland, and it was effectively a brutal end to the last rising, and the Jacobites were never again able to marshal enough military effectiveness to make another try at it. The goal of these Jacobites was to restore the Stuarts to the throne of not just Scotland, but of Britain in general, and that includes all three kingdoms. And that is the basic story of the 45.
And coming back to this idea of the international aspect and the international arena during this very chaotic and unstable period of European history, from a little bit of light reading that I've been doing before doing this interview, I found it very interesting to see that Louis XIV was a supporter of James's cause to restore himself to the throne. But when Louis XIV died and his son succeeded him in the throne, there is this shift in perspective when it came to France's involvement. We end up seeing a Louis XV that doesn't want to get involved at the beginning, but then at least allegedly offers his support to Charles. So I wanted to ask you about this. What did it mean to have this support back, even if it maybe wasn't particularly real for Charles's cause?
Yeah, it's a good question. Louis was tied, and all of France was tied very closely with the fortunes of the Jacobites' efforts to restore the Stuarts to the throne for a number of reasons. They had been hosting the Stuart court in exile, France had, for many years after the Revolution. It had since also existed in Italy, the exiled court. And so Jacobite schemes were taking place on these countries' soil. Uh, this put them in a precarious situation politically, and it was difficult for Louis to flat out come out and say, we totally support the Jacobite cause, but behind the scenes there was lots of scheming going on, making offers to help out, promises, treaties to be made to send troops over to aid the cause, to aid the efforts in Britain. And the other thing to consider is that Louis was involved in the War of the Austrian Succession, and he knew that any type of attack on home territory in Britain would distract the British government from their attentions on the continent, where they were embroiled in that long, bloody conflict.
Mm-hmm. I find that very interesting because when it comes to drawing parallelisms with some of the things I tend to research about, mostly when it comes to Latin American revolutionary movements in general, you usually see a certain continuous progression of foreign governments offering their acknowledgement and their support, then quickly, very quickly withdrawing it when it came to their own goals and their own uh, agendas. One example that very much comes to mind, that is, it's maybe it started happening a little later after we already had achieved collectively our independencies from Spain and from Portugal in South America, is the Monroe Doctrine from the U.S., which was very much sold, to put it mildly, to Latin America and South America in general as a forever promise of sorts that ended up being just enforced whenever it actually suited the U.S. To do so. So I think it's very interesting to see how this, because I feel like being able to believe on Charles's part and on the part of the Jacobites in general, that there was actually aid coming, that they were going to receive support. I'm imagining that must have had an important impact in actually uh, motivating people to rise and to fight.
Absolutely true. And he did send troops and money and guns and material over to help, but not with the type of commitment that was needed to effect broad change and stir up enough support in Britain to oust the government and hold it once that government had been ousted.
Okay. Another question that I wanted to ask you before we go on with the events in general, is sort of a personal question. Why this? Why exactly did you start studying, or where did your interest in the Jacobite movement, and particular this period of the Jacobite movement? Because as you've said, it is a very lengthy historical period. But what drew you towards this period between the Glorious Revolution and the Battle of Culloden?
Yeah, the long 18th century is, it's called the long 18th century for a reason. There was a lot that happened. It's very, very intriguing on many levels. It was the birth of the modern. We see intellectual, industrial revolutions and progress made, and how land was used, how people thought about the world, the Enlightenments, so many interesting aspects of cultures all over the world, certainly. but specifically in Britain and Scotland, for me, these are the things that first attracted me to the period. And the Jacobites specifically had always, the story of the Jacobites had always been imbued with a certain pageantry and romance. And, I challenge you to find a single historian who wasn't originally brought into their interest of history by romance and pageantry and the strange fiction tales that we hear along the way, and the romanticized books that we read as perhaps young children or young adults. And with me too, that was the main thing that hooked me in. And when I started researching the real history and getting my hands on primary sources in the archives, it changed everything. In the truth, of course, is much more strange than fiction, is much more interesting than fiction. And from there, I kind of developed a love affair with our treatment now in today's world of how we view the Jacobite struggle, the Jacobite challenge, versus how it was viewed to the people on the ground in Britain and around the world in the 18th century.
I think that's an excellent answer. I think that I don't think there's a single historian, regardless of their focus or of their methodology, that hasn't been interested in this idea, in this intrigue that maybe to a degree there is a degree of idealization sometimes of certain periods in history that comes with this element of romance that you were mentioning. And this is certainly a period of great change and of great monumental shifts in general when it comes to the Western world, which is of course where we usually set our sights on. Um, so I think that this is a this long 18th century is a fascinating period to study these intrigues and these schisms in what we understand to be political reality, because this is the period in which a lot of things start to happen that shape the world as we know it today. This concept of the emergence of nation states as we will eventually come to know them, changes in military tactics and strategies, changes, of course, in industrialization and technology that, of course, will come after this period in Great Britain, particularly in England. There are definitely going to be shaping the decades to come and the centuries to come as well, which is something that I think that we are going to be touching also upon later in the episode. Um, but before we go on, we should probably talk about the Battle of Culloden itself, because this episode is likely going to be released on April the 20th, and 4 days before that, on April the 16th, is going to be the 275th anniversary of the Battle of Culloden. Which is why we wanted to address this, because it's going to be an important landmark that is going to be talked about and celebrated. Well, maybe celebrated is not the right term, but definitely addressed in many historical circles.
Yes, indeed. Commemorated is the term that I like to use.
Yes, exactly. That's the word I was failing to come to.
Some people will celebrate for sure, and I think that a lot of people will mark it in different ways based on what the battle and the effects of the battle means to them, and this is the case with battles all around the world in every country in the world. Culloden holds a particular significance because of the perception of tragedy around it and the reality of tragedy around it. The fact that it was the end of a century-long movement, the way that it ended in very quick and brutal showing, and the after effects of suppression and repression of different cultures in Scotland, Highland culture and other cultures as well. Episcopalians and Catholics, the persecutions of them continued along, backed by legislation to disarm certain communities, perceived as recalcitrant by the British government. And a lot of people blame the death of the Highland Clan system on the after effects of Culloden, and that it was essentially a pointed genocide to the Highland clans. And some very prominent historians have posited that before, and it wouldn't be totally wrong to consider that. But I think at its base level, Culloden means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and we imbue a lot of our own ideas and our own emotions on what happened on that field. And anybody that's been there will tell you how incredibly evocative it is, even for a battlefield, even if you don't know what happened there. And I think part of that is that the field itself and the moor where it's located, a wind-blasted open stretch of ground in the Highlands, and also the fact that it had been a graveyard for thousands of years. You know, the burials and cairns and all sorts of things have been dug up on the field through the years as different excavations have been made, and it's been a sacred place to a lot of people for a long time.
And you mentioned something that I find quite interesting that I would like to ask you about. This concept of the Highland clans of Scotland being very harshly repressed and eventually eliminated by Britain following the aftermath of Culloden. What exactly was it about these clans? What was it about them that Britain felt that was that needed to be eliminated and eradicated from their political landscape?
Well, first of all, the Highland clans are still around, so they were never eradicated, which is good news. It was the clan system that Britain was after, and part of that was because the clan system that had existed in various guises for hundreds of years was a continual threat to the British government. And there was a huge amount of prejudice and distrust built up by urban communities all throughout Britain against what they perceived as atavistic, savage, wild, foreign people who spoke a different language, who wore funny clothing, who didn't care about the same things that modern progressives think about. So all these things were built up. There was also a great amount of resources. There was a ton of land to be had. And so there are different motivations that can be ascribed to the reasons that Britain was interested in breaking up the clan system. I think probably as it relates to Jacobitism, one of the greatest ones was the fact that Highlanders and the different clans in the Gaelic regions of Scotland were continually rising and rebelling against the government and proved to be a very intractable threat that was difficult to police. And we see the efforts that went into policing these recalcitrant areas in the Highlands by looking at the barracks and forts that were built, some of roads built by General Wade, Field Marshal Wade, to move troops around more easily. We see significant occupation of British troops in the Highlands after Culloden for decades. And we see heritable jurisdictions abolished after Culloden, which is the ancestral rights of clan chiefs to command their tenants into battle and to do other things. And eventually we see Highland clearances creep in the ensuing decades and into the next century. And that's been considered an extension of what was already happening between Britain and the Highlands. But it's also important to note that the British government in London wasn't just prejudiced against the Highlanders. There were prejudice against lots of what was termed North Britain. And this brings into focus the sharp divide between England and Scotland during the Jacobite challenge. even though it was not only about England and Scotland. There was plenty of other determinants why somebody would join the Jacobite cause or fight against it. Certainly wasn't only a national enterprise.
And that you bring up a point that I wanted to ask you about as well, that it has to do with this social makeup of the Jacobite movement, and the motivations, the cultural and social motivations behind people joining, whether joining voluntarily or otherwise, as you've mentioned. So, to just can you tell us a little bit about that, about that social makeup that we're still very much talking about today?
Yeah, certainly. And the constituency of Jacobitism, of historical Jacobitism, is really the front and center of my own studies, and what I find most intriguing and interesting. We touched on the fact that it was a 100-year-old movement. It was a very, very long collection of struggles over a protracted period of time. And I think it's important to understand that although we can define Jacobitism kind of as a whole as the effort to take back the throne of Britain and the three kingdoms for the Stuart line, no single ideology can last untouched for that long through successive generations of people. And one of the things that I like to focus on is through that century, the Jacobite century, I think Jacobitism itself shifts and changes along with the fortunes of the people who were involved, both for and against it. So, the reason that somebody might join in open battle in 1715 might be totally different to the reasons why somebody would do so 30 years later in the 45. And we do see differences in people's reasoning and their motives for putting their lives on the line, whether they had volunteered to do so, or perhaps they were forced to do so by a feudal superior or somebody who had something against them. So we see lots of different motivations, and I like to consider Jihadism as kind of a kaleidoscope of different reasons, kind of under a shared aegis, a single umbrella um, that we can identify as this ideological movement. But if we had been standing, say, on the front lines of the Jacobite army at Culloden, and you were to ask different people what they were doing there, I think you'd get a whole lot of different answers based on where the people existed, where they lived, what their political background was, what their practical needs were, and what their um, confessional religious backgrounds were. So it was a very diverse community involved in the Jacobite era, and that community, those different communities shifted as the century wore on. Um, One perfect example of this was that anti-unionism was much more central to Jacobite values, popular Jacobite values, right after the Act of Union in 1707. So in 1715, when it was still possible to maybe repeal the Union or dissolve it and reestablish the Scottish Parliament, you had a lot more people espousing this anti-Union rhetoric. And you see that written on swords and on different standards of certain regiments and people's depositions when they were captured, death to Union, anti-Union. And then by the 45, that's still a central tenet of Jacobitism, but it is less focused upon as we move farther away from the Union 30 years later, and some people are more comfortable with it. But it's safe to say that Jacobitism carried under its umbrella numerous different motivations. And these motivations were solicited by Jacobite leadership, including both James Francis Edward and Charles Edward himself. In their proclamations and in their circulars and their broadsheets, they promised many different things to many different people if they would help them try to secure the crown once again for the Stuart family.
And that brings what might be a tricky question. do you believe that, because again, this question is more about your personal interpretation of the historical of the historical record. Do you believe that Charles was actually willing to fulfill his promises if had he succeeded after 45?
Well, you've offered an excellent disclaimer, and I'll take you up on that disclaimer, which is that I am an expert only as far as that I've read a whole bunch of stuff, and I have particular perspectives on it. Everybody has a different opinion,
As we are all, are we all?
but yeah, I certainly have my own beliefs about it, and uh, I do believe that Charles Edward believed very, very strongly in his right to the throne. His family, for a very long time, had been divine right monarchs with a deep tradition uh, of monarchy in Scotland and in Britain. And this was something that not just he, but his followers, his supplicants, whether it be people on very high in the Jacobite ranks, politicians and soldiers, and people in the exiled Stuart court, or people on the out in the fields laboring who believed that the Stuarts would uh, create better conditions from them. I do think that Charles Edward intended to provide these things for his followers if his father would have been back on the throne. It's difficult to say what if, and I tend to avoid what if questions and counterfactuals. But I think their intentions were good. I think their intentions were real. After capturing Edinburgh in the autumn of 1745, the Jacobite Council instituted some changes. Charles said he dissolved the Union. He established a provincial government. He wanted to, call back the Scottish Parliament, but these things weren't sustained, and they weren't broadly enacted by people directly outside of Edinburgh at the time, under their direct control. So in order to accomplish these things and to provide these things that he had promised and that his father had promised in their proclamations, they really had quite a steep hill to climb first. And that was to take London, depose the king, restore James Francis Edward to the throne of the three kingdoms.
Yeah, it was definitely a long shot. So yeah, no, of course I understand. That's why I offered a disclaimer at first. I mean that it's absolutely up to your personal interpretation. Um, Mostly I ask that question because when I look at this idea of, okay, a movement like this one, a rebellion, because we call this a rebellion because it failed. Had it succeeded, we would have called it a revolution. It very much relies upon promises. An alliance is formed based on said promises. Um, I'm trying to find a connection between what you research and what I usually tend to research. I'm thinking about the revolutionary movements in Latin America, particularly in South America, following the Argentine Revolution of 1810. Um, Mostly because even though the Haitian Revolution happened before, it succeeded in 1804. It was very much themselves for themselves and by themselves. It wasn't a revolution on a wider scale. When it comes to the Argentine Revolution, it is of significant importance for the rest of South America because it ended up spreading to Chile and Peru, uh, due to mainly due to the strategy devised by General Jose de San Martin, who is one of our founding fathers. But this concept of having leadership promise things to the people, but also to literally other peoples, much like Charles did with the Irish, for example, which is, as far as I'm aware, he had, uh, following the promises that James had done, had made to them. Down here, and I say down here because I live as far south as south goes, on the continental scale. There is this concept of continental revolution that was mostly based on, okay, we need to kick the Spanish off first, before we can help each other out build our own nations, our own states. Um, but those promises were made at a time in which actually getting rid of Spanish colonialism was very much a long shot, in which many people did not believe that it was going to happen. Many people did not believe that the revolutionary wars were going to succeed because, because of mainly 300 years of Spanish colonialism, that had taught, the peoples living here, what we call the criollos, the Creole peoples, that it was nearly impossible to get rid of the colonial system, of colonial oppression. So this concept of promises being made under very, under dire circumstances, and faced with probably not the best odds, I think it's an interesting element of what the social makeup looks like. Because again, I want to go back to this idea that there were some people who fought for the Jacobites who did not have the freedom to choose not to. And I would like to ask you about that in particular.
It's definitely hotly contested in the circles of Jacobite studies scholarship, this concept of forced recruitment or impressment. I think that, no matter what war is being fought, and for whatever reason you have people who are drawn into it, and impressment in national armies and government-backed armies are commonplace, especially in the 18th century. So to that degree, I don't think there's anything special or particularly unique about um, conditions of impressment within the Jacobite army. But I think what's most important here is that there's an irony about this movement that was predicated upon freeing a nation or a group of nations, an alliance of nations from foreign oppression. And they use these terms in Jacobite books and documents and sermons. This concept of being under the yoke of a foreign usurper, meaning in this case King George II of Hanover, a German, they claim. And I think there's a great irony when you look at a force espousing these concepts of freedom from foreign oppression and then enacting draconian measures to pull people into the army, make them fight for this freedom that maybe they wouldn't necessarily have a stake in for whatever reason. I do think that impressment in the 45 has definitely been played down, by even by very accomplished scholars. I think it's something that needs taking a closer look at. I think we have the resources to do by looking at first person accounts, corroborating certain depositions and trial records, and precognitions with witnesses who claim to have seen people try to escape or break their bonds of Jacobite recruiters going around to different areas of Scotland and even Northern England trying to recruit people into the cause. So yeah, I'm very fascinated and very interested in the concept of forced recruiting and that ironic twist that people think of Jacobitism today as a striking out against um, foreign tyranny by a sovereign nation, and how prevalent these recruiting tactics were within the Jacobite army, as admitted by the recruiters themselves, by witnesses, people who lived on the land, factors, and even lairds who owned the land that was being recruited upon. It's a very interesting area to be studied more closely, I think.
Yeah, I think that particular irony is fascinating when it comes to, because we are certainly used to these periods, or well, we're certainly used to most warring periods to have forceful conscription into the army and to the armed forces in general. I mean, that happens in several places in the world even today. We have several examples of countries in which forceful conscription is still very much a real thing. Um, but when it comes to analyzing a movement that was predicated upon freedom, upon liberty as a basic fundamental principle, it does seem interesting to me that you're talking about this having been downplayed to a degree in historiography in general, which is something that we also share in our revolutionary periods down here. Going back to the example of José de San Martin, there is a very one of the most popular phrases that are attributed to him is in Spanish. It's "Seamos libres y lo demás no importa nada," which would mean something similar to "Let us be free and nothing else matters." And then he went on to conscript forcefully thousands of teenagers into his continental army to free Chile and Peru. Um, so it's an interesting, because when you look at and I'm sure that the same happens when you look at the historical record and you look at sources there, primary sources there. When you look at letters written by José de San Martin to Simón Bolívar, one of the other great liberators of South America, um, you basically see them uh, admitting to this irony and to this paradox and justifying it by, okay, yeah, sure, we are going to be free, but later on. For now, we have to fight against this oppression. It's sort of um, a very real practical application of means justifying the ends. Um, but it is interesting to see and to come across a movement that is usually associated with these principles of freedom, having built upon not so much freedom as one would assume at a first glance.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the 45 and the Jacobite movement, I'm certainly not saying that most people were forced into it, but I think a far greater number had less agency and less freedom, personal freedom, to resist these um, broad sweeping recruitment drives. And we see precedent for that on the other side during the Covenanting period in Scotland as well. So again, we're weighing, we're commenting on specific people's experiences, and I think the importance of bringing up kind of wide swaths of impressment is to show that it's not necessarily cut and dried, that this was for Scotland or against Scotland, that this was for freedom or against freedom. I mean, in any war, both sides want particular freedoms, and so that word is a very charged one, and perhaps not a very accurate one to use. Um, you had the Whig establishment, predicated on Lockean principles like liberty and property, and the beautiful irony of the 45 is that one of the transport ships that transported Jacobite prisoners called liberty and property, and here you have hundreds of you know Jacobite captives in horrible, squalid, disease-ridden conditions being moved to prison in London from Scotland.
Um, okay, so before we continue, because we are coming upon the end of this fascinating interview, I wanted to ask you to talk to us briefly about your digital project, about the Jacobite database of 1745. What can you tell us about it?
Oh, great. Yeah, the JDB 1745 is a project I've been working on for pretty much my whole academic career since about 2003. And the idea from it stemmed from, going to different conferences and seeing different scholars in the field, um, at odds about concepts about demographic concepts like where people are from, their ages, their regions, their religions. And I thought, it would be fascinating to have an electronic tool that everybody can use where we can put in a tremendous amount of information, all from primary sources, and conduct what's called prosopography. Prosopography is essentially a study of a large breadth of biographical information to discern general patterns and compare and contrast different things about them. So it involves biography, it involves genealogy, it involves connections between people and places. We can turn these data points into graphic visualizations like maps, migratory patterns, diaspora, things like that. So JDB 1745 is a prosopographical database. And right now there's about 25,000 entries in it. It's still being developed, so it's not available for public use. But the concept is that you can do any kind of search you want, whether it be by any aspect of the person that you're looking for. It could be name, it could be aliases, it could be different variants of their names, their places, their religion, the value of the estate that they lived upon, how many witnesses were involved with their trial, and the list goes on and on. Anything that we know about them, we're moving into the database and turning that information into searchable data. And the project is based upon doing this in a non-destructive way. So instead of the curators and the team members deciding who is who, we're putting in raw records with the most objective data as possible to let people decide for themselves. Use it as a research tool as opposed to an end goal, an analysis. We're going to let the users do the analysis themselves. So we have a description of that up on the website, which is jdb1745.net. Research blog associated with it called Little Rebellions, where take case studies from the database and describe different aspects of Jacobitism in its late era and in the last years of its effectiveness. And we're hoping to get some funding in the coming years to finally move the beta into a usable database for people for free.
That's fantastic. I think that that's an excellent project. This idea of it not being an absolute thing, a fully closed, fully developed, just okay. This is what it is. Deal with it. If it's useful to you, fine. If it's not, go away. But instead, trying to make it more open, trying to make it because to a point, at least from a research standpoint, it pretty much sounds like it's going to be open access, which is fantastic because even if the software itself is not going to be open access, I'm assuming, and it's because that would be chaotic probably. I think that allowing researchers to draw their own conclusions, to find their own way, in a sense, I think that that's an excellent goal. So best of luck with that. I hope it's ready as soon as possible. Um, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Yes, we do too. We do too. And one of the great aspects of one of the great effects of what we hope to accomplish with the database is that once people use it, we're going to be totally transparent about all the archival sources that we're drawing them. And so there will be a paper trail for users to follow where they can visit the archives, hopefully when the pandemic opens up and lockdown opens up a little more. We all have vaccines, we can travel again and get into the archives. There'll be a nice paper trail for people to follow and be able to do their own research.
That's excellent. And of course, we are going to be including links to the website on our Reddit post, even if it's not ready yet, so people can keep it saved in their bookmarks tab for when it's open and ready. Um, and I just one last question before we wrap things up. That it's more of a broader general question. Um, in so many words, For you, what would you say is the historical importance of the Battle of Culloden, especially when it comes to British historiography?
That's such a fascinating question, especially on this big anniversary. Um, I think Culloden is an icon and a talisman, if you will. People consider it to be a sacred reminder of something important that's happened that they identify with or that they can connect with. And so we've imbued so many different things upon Culloden over the years that really the myth is almost indistinguishable from the reality. And even the realities are eyewitness based, and different people have different opinions. And so when people visit the field, they imbue their own emotions onto it and their own experiences onto it. And if they believe, Jacobitism was the last chance for Scotland to be independent, then that's what they see, and it means something important to them. If they see that it was a civil war and there were brother fighting against brother, and Scots killing Scots and English on both sides, and Catholics and Protestants, all the divisions between the Highland clans all on one field, then they're going to get something totally different out of it. But Culloden is a marker between the memory of what Scotland was and what Scotland is today for a lot of people. And when they go there and they visit this place, it's so evocative that these are things that a lot of people think about and remember. And so it's important. It's important to a lot of people, and there's a lot of emotion around the place. It's a pilgrimage site to many people.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I as I told you in our pre-recording session, I don't usually approach most subjects related to war because I'm a historical musicologist. I know about the wars Argentina has been involved in, not much beyond that in general. But I think that this speaks to a more how do I put this? I believe that this speaks to a broader social aspect of this period. Not It's not just a war or a rebellion or just a battle that lasted an hour, if I'm not mistaken. Um, it's about the people involved, and really, this is what history is to me, at least. To me, being a historian is about uh, th- it's about never forgetting the human element, the human component behind the events and the periods and processes that I'm studying. If I'm studying a specific concert piece, I'm studying it not from a technical perspective, but I'm trying to go behind the scenes to say it in a theatrical way. I'm trying to go and see what was happening in what was going on in the composer's life at the time of writing something. Um, and again, when it comes to analyzing this huge monumental processes in which so many people were involved, in which so many people were lost, which is also something very important to remember. I think that trying to keep in mind this human element is fundamental. So thank you very much for bringing these people, these very real people, to the forefront of what you're studying, of what you're researching, and to of your project as well, your digital project as well.
Seb, thanks so much for giving me the time. It was a pleasure to meet with you, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Well, this has been the Ask Historians podcast. Thank you everyone for tuning in.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.